You are watching France 24 with live coverage here from in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, a cathedral that has stood for 850 years, and yet last night, in the space of just a few hours, saw two-thirds of the roof and the iconic spire burned. There is a press conference underway right now given by the Culture Minister and the Deputy Interior Minister. Let's listen in.
Vulnerabilities have been identified, notably the roof of the cathedral and part of the northern transept, which part of it has to be secured, and 5 residential buildings behind the church have been evacuated for 48 hours to make the building secure. Securing the edifice from inside will continue to make it possible for the firefighters to enter the cathedral with staff from the Ministry of Culture to recover works of art. The Minister of Culture will explain the situation of the cultural assets. I would like to thank all the firefighters, the military, the firefighters of Paris, the police officers, with the staff of the Ministry of Culture, who have done a remarkable job under the coordination of the prefect of Paris, of police of Paris. 20 civil servants have been courageously committed to have entered the 2 bell towers of the cathedral, and their intervention saved the edifice, and we now know that if they had arrived 15 or 20 minutes later, they wouldn't have been able to intervene. I'm now going to give the floor to the Minister of Culture. First of all, I'd like to pay tribute to the firefighters, to all those who have been mobilized yesterday and today. The works of art, the treasure of the cathedral has been secured and deposited in the town hall, the city hall of Paris. I'd like to thank the Archbishop's service, the police, the firefighters, who have worked hard to secure the St. Louis tunic and the crown of thorns. The rest of the treasure of the cathedral has been put in a safe place, or will be put in a safe place. The great paintings will only be withdrawn on Friday morning. Apparently, the fire didn't cause any damage to the great paintings, but the smoke caused some damage. So all the works of art will be put in a safe place in the Louvre, dehumidified and restored. In terms of the works of art, there are the rose windows of the transepts, which have not been affected, and the western rose window, which, if we can anticipate on Friday, if we can withdraw the works of art before, then we will do so. But our main concern today is to secure what remains of the edifice. The chief architect in charge of the cathedral has been working with his staff and other members of the Ministry of Culture with the firefighters of Paris to secure the location. A number of points have been identified as particularly vulnerable. The roof, what remains of the roof, should hold.
Qui a été lié à l'effondrement
hier de la flèche. The spire, as you know, collapsed yesterday, and the roof of the northern transept collapsed. So everybody is mobilized with the firefighters of Paris. They are deciding what has to be done to preserve the parts of the cathedral which are still standing.
Oui, écoutez, oui, nous les avons rencontrés. Je vous rappelle qu'il y a quand même 500
500 firefighters were committed to the fight against the fire. Reserve forces have intervened as well, so 500 firefighters have been committed by the prefecture of Paris with reinforcements from the suburbs of Paris. I would like to pay tribute to their courage and determination. They're tired, but they have fought the fire with determination and courage, and, both from outside the cathedral and at the risk of their lives inside the cathedral as well.
No, just wait. We were just listening there to that press conference. Coming out in the wake of that tragic fire here in Paris at Notre-Dame Cathedral. Those images that were seen around the world last night. A fire that devastated 2/3 of the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral, and it also brought down, crashing to the ground, the iconic spire. Take a look at this image that was seen around the world. That image there of the spire crashing down to the ground in Paris. With me now is France 24's Doug Herbert. Doug, you were walking around earlier, just around the damage that we see there outside Notre-Dame Cathedral. Tell us a bit more about what you saw, what you heard.
Well, what's interesting, a lot of people are trying to do their own, personal inventory of the damage. And if you don't know Notre-Dame well, your first impression might be, well, what's the difference? What really happened? It seems to be largely intact. The North Tower facade, they're standing, everything's fine. The fact of the matter is the gaping absence is that spire, the 300-foot spire, which ironically happened to be under a renovation that began about a year ago, which is why you see that scaffolding. There'd been 250,000 tons of scaffolding put up to try to basically take some lead out of that spire. Now, the irony is the spire itself that fell last night was not the original one on Notre Dame. It was actually a spire that was designed and built and put on the cathedral back in 1861, Viollet-le-Duc, a name known to just about every French household. So that was itself a replacement spire. This renovation project with the scaffolding you see is believed to be around the area where the fire itself started. And at this point, they do not see any arson or criminal intent. At least there's no reason, no path leading them to believe that. What they are saying is they believe that it could, and I have to emphasize could, because it's speculation at this point, have to do with the construction work that was being done. There was apparently welding being done in that area, an area called the attic, just above the roof, under the spire. And there were a lot of wooden beams there, wooden chips, very, very flammable. All you would need is one spark from a welder's instrument, and perhaps that fire could start to smolder for a while, because apparently that is what happened. It smoldered for quite a while before you actually saw the transept and the smoke billowing out of that transept last night.
Doug, many people who have been here to Paris, who visited Notre-Dame Cathedral, know how famous it is for its relics, for its beautiful rose windows. What more do we know about the state of those things?
Well, first of all, a lot of it right now is intact, but the fact of the matter is that Notre-Dame itself had been a wreck in many respects. It has undergone everything from war to conflict to pillaging over the centuries. The gargoyles themselves, the iconic gargoyles, they had broken. A lot of the balustrades had become crumbling and collapsing. Some of the gargoyles absolutely were replaced by plastic. So a lot of what you see on Notre Dame today is replacement, for the original material, which was already in very bad disrepair. Water had begun leaking through the roofs after repeated rain over the decades, the centuries. Hence this very badly needed renovation project. So Notre Dame itself, while there are parts of the very original edifice still intact and still standing, a lot of what we had seen today and still see today is part of an evolving cathedral, and a cathedral which has been sort of in bits and pieces, patched together, repatched together over the centuries through all of French history, basically. It's seen it all.
Doug talking to us there about what Notre-Dame has seen over the years, 850 years of existence. I was saying construction began on Notre-Dame almost 1,000 years ago. But then just last night, in the space of a few hours, this devastating fire came and racked the roof. 2/3 of the roof destroyed, brought down the iconic spire. Our Clément Bonnereau takes a look back now at what exactly happened last night.
It survived the French Revolution, 2 world wars, and now a massive fire. Notre-Dame Cathedral is still standing and the worst has been avoided. 2/3 of the roof and the spire have collapsed, but the main structure, including the 2 bell towers, has been saved. Firefighters battled the blaze for more than 8 hours. They say the situation is finally under control. The roof of the 12th century monument caught fire shortly before 7 p.m. local time. It quickly spread into a towering inferno, with flames and thick yellowish smoke billowing into the sky, engulfing one of the cathedral's landmark rectangular towers. Nearby buildings were evacuated as fears mounted that the entire structure would collapse. A few minutes later, the cathedral's spire came down. A moment seared into the memory of horrified onlookers.
There are no words. I can't even describe what's happening right now. Paris is collapsing.
It's horrible, especially when we saw the spire collapse.
It's a catastrophe.
As news sunk in, Parisians and tourists congregated around the cathedral to see the sight with their own eyes. Some struggling to hold back tears, others singing hymns or saying prayers.
It's very sad. It's one of the great monuments of France. I live not far away. It's devastating to see a monument like this burn.
Visiting the scene after cancelling a major speech on TV, French President Emmanuel Macron praised the courage of the 500 firefighters deployed on site, one of whom was badly injured.
Over centuries, the cathedral has been improved and changed, and so I say to you very solemnly this evening, this cathedral will be rebuilt. It is part of our destiny as France and our project for the years to come.
Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, meanwhile, praised the city's solidarity in coming together to save the cathedral's works of art and objects of worship.
A human chain immediately sprung into place. First, the firefighters who do incredible work. Then also a chain of solidarity, especially in saving the artworks.
The 850-year-old church was undergoing renovation when the fire broke. Prosecutors have now opened an investigation to determine what may have caused it.
This is our continuing live coverage from Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. Notre-Dame that was racked by a devastating fire last night that destroyed 2/3 of the roof, brought down its iconic spire. To talk a bit more about what this cathedral means, not just here in France, but around the world, let's bring in now Amicia Pellissé. You're the president of Catho Voice France. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us there from Poitiers. Just talk to us a bit more about why Notre-Dame is so much a symbol, not just for the nation, but for the entire world.
I think, as you say very rightly, Notre-Dame is a huge symbol for Catholics and non-Catholics, for the nation, for the world. I think for everyone, it's one of the most iconic image of France. You have the Eiffel Tower and you have Notre-Dame. It's been celebrated in novels, in films, in songs by ABBA, if I remember well. I think this tragedy particularly has also reminded us that Notre-Dame is so connected to the history of our country, to its Christian history, but to the history of the nation at large. I was initially relieved this morning to see that the entire structure was still there, but then you realize that the wooden structure, the 12th century wooden structure just below the roof, is basically gone, And we're talking here about bits of trunks which have been assembled in the 13th century, made with tree trunks. Some of them dated back to the 8th or 9th century. So we're talking about Charlemagne here, his times roughly. And so we're suddenly realizing that we had this jewel. We didn't know all of its corners and surprises, and most of it is gone. So we'll be able to rebuild it. But there's definitely a sense of irretrievable loss that I think the world is feeling, and not just France this morning.
Amicia, you're the president of Catho Voice France. This is Holy Week, the week that runs up to Easter celebration, such an important celebration for so many Catholics around the world. The crown of thorns is usually shown in Notre-Dame Cathedral behind me on Good Friday. That obviously isn't going to be taking place this year. Tell us a bit more about the effect that this devastation on Notre-Dame Cathedral is having for Catholics.
It is a devastating effect. As you're saying, this is Holy Week, so it's a week associated with mourning, remembering the passing and the death of Christ. It's a week when Christians and Catholics come together to celebrate one of the key messages and mysteries of our faith. I think we all already have a feeling that our church has been badly shaken those past months with scandals and affairs, and this is, in a way, it feels like it's the final stroke. But on the other hand, I was struck at how much this has also become a symbol of national unity, of the unity of the faithful, but also of the nation. And I think during this Holy Week, which is a time when the nation comes together, when the faithful come together, this is a very big symbol, and it's a symbol that reminds us that our community is a community of prayer and not just a building. And I think we'll be feeling the loss of the tradition associated with Notre Dame. So the relics, the crown of thorns, brought in by St. Louis in the 1230s, just when that wooden structure was being finished, will be missing, because we're not going to be able to, it's not going to be displayed in the cathedral as it's been for decades and centuries. But perhaps it's also a calling to what are the roots of our faith, and the roots of our faith are not buildings, not even if they are, as Pope Francis said, a jewel of collective memory. They're not even relics, but there's something much smaller and much bigger at the same time, and that's the living presence of Christ, and we truly believe in that.
Amicia Pellissier, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. So you're the president of Catho Voice France. Now, as you can imagine, as the fire was raging through the roof of Notre-Dame last night, people around all of this area here in the 4th arrondissement of Paris stopped to stare, to watch the damage as it was taking place. Many of the people who saw just that were people who actually work here in Notre-Dame Cathedral or with the diocese. We'll hear now from the Vicar General of the Paris Diocese, who was there last night and who witnessed the damage firsthand.
I looked in through the front doors. Inside, I saw the firefighters and a little robot that was spraying water around. What was really impressive was the hole, just above the choir, made by the spire that collapsed. Flames were still coming out of it. It felt like we were in hell. It was pitch black, and in the back, illuminated by that robot, was the cross, the big golden cross that still stood. And to the right, I saw the famous statue of Notre-Dame. It was still there. I thought, everything's on fire, but the cross and the Virgin Mary are here.
We are here live from Notre-Dame de Paris, the cathedral that was ravaged by fire last night here in the French capital. With me is France 24's Doug Herbert. We're going to talk a bit more about the damages that the cathedral sustained in just a minute's time, but tell us a bit more first about what was saved.
Yeah, quite well. Apparently, from what we just heard a few minutes ago, quite a bit was saved. Remember, a lot of the richness and the vast wealth of Notre-Dame Cathedral was inside the cathedral. We have not obviously been able to go inside and inspect it ourselves to see the damage within. But what we heard throughout the night, and now has been confirmed for us this morning, is a lot of the artworks in the cathedral, because essentially it's a giant museum. It's like walking into the Louvre in many respects. The artworks, there was sort of, a chain of humanity of firefighters that passed a lot of those artworks out, a lot of the artifacts, a lot of the holy artifacts. Let's remember, this is the place where kings and queens were married and buried. Their crypts are in here, and surrounding those crypts and attending them really are a whole host, a panoply of artifacts, holy and historic artifacts. That is what the firefighters were desperately trying to save, even as they were battling 500 of them, this raging fire last night. We believe that the rose window, the famous rosary window, the stained glass, was intact, was saved. I'm sure that they're going to subject it to further inspections, because Notre Dame obviously was a panoply of stained glass windows, famous for them, not original stained glass windows, but which were installed in the church over the centuries. How many of those are still intact? How many may have been damaged? We still have to wait for the final confirmation, more inspections. The giant organ, questions about whether or not any of that has survived intact, that people around the world came to Notre Dame to hear the beautiful chamber music, the organ music. Its sounds were really unique in the world, in Western civilization. But a lot was safeguarded, and one of the things that thankfully perhaps a lot of French are discovering this morning is that a lot of the heritage that perhaps they thought lost last night is still intact. That said, a lot of it is going to have to be restored, and a lot of that restoration work, already people are speculating, is going to have to be the work of creative imagination, perhaps not in the exact original form of when it was built starting in the 12th century, but perhaps according to a lot of the know-how that has developed since then, and perhaps a reinvention, in a sense, of Notre Dame. So the restored Notre Dame, ultimately, will also be, to a certain extent, a reinvented and a reimagined Notre Dame.
Doug, thank you for that. Let's now take a look back at some of the damage that Notre Dame suffered last night in the wake of that fire. Here's Cole Stengler.
Notre Dame is still standing, but the damage is extensive, according to France's junior interior minister, and doubts linger over how the structure will remain intact.
The structure has of course been saved, but we have to stay vigilant. We need to conduct assessments. A fire of this scale can have a significant impact on structures, so we need to make sure they're still stable, so that our firefighters are able to enter the cathedral once more.
Gone in the blaze that erupted Monday night, 2/3 of the cathedral's roof, along with its spire. But by Tuesday morning, the 2 bell towers remain, and Notre Dame's head priest said officials managed to save many of its relics.
We saved the crown of thorns from inside, as well as St. Louis' tunic. I think we saved some chalices. The treasure wasn't damaged.
Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo said the city would lend a helping hand.
Since we're neighbours with Notre Dame, we immediately offered to store the artworks in the Paris Town Hall, in the Saint-Jean room, where we usually hold exhibits. This was to safeguard these paintings, these artworks, and of course, the crown of thorns and the Saint Louis tunic, which are also in a safe place.
Photos after the fire showed the extent of roof damage and a cross still in place at the altar. While the state of Notre Dame's stained glass windows remains unclear, 16 statues once connected to the spire are safe. They were removed as part of renovations last week.
Here I am still in front of Notre-Dame de Paris alongside Douglas Herbert. Doug, we take a look now at Notre-Dame and we can see that its roof is gone despite the scaffolding that's still there from the renovations. The spire as well that was toppled last night here in Paris. Let's talk a bit though about other tragedies that other cathedrals have seen here in France over the centuries and that have come out triumphant finally, even if it was decades later.
Yeah, starting by the way with Notre Dame itself, because as we've said, it has witnessed the entire array of French history of wars and conflicts and pillaging. The communards back in the 18th century, they basically set fire to the cathedral. And, during the Revolution, it was actually closed down for several years because, the religious affiliations and everything, it was seen as something that was somehow heretical. So Notre-Dame itself has been on the receiving end of a lot of calumny and a lot of also damage over the centuries. Obviously, this being perhaps, some of the worst it's seen. But let's not forget, Reims Cathedral, a lot of tourists who come to France, if they're going to see another cathedral besides Notre-Dame, if they're going to leave Paris, travel around France, they'll go to Chartres, they'll see Reims. Reims Cathedral was bombed in September 1914, just before the German troops arrived. Awful, terrible bombing damage. The cathedral, they started the work on it 5 years later, the renovation work, in 1919. It only reopened to the public, Reims Cathedral, in 1938. So 20 years later. And even today, there's still some work going on inside to try to, a few touches here and there. Nantes Cathedral, another world-famous cathedral, it suffered a fire in 1972, which also required years of restoration, renovation. There have also been quite a few fires around Paris, smaller churches, a lot of the older buildings in Paris. We forget it, this is so iconic, so the whole world's eyes are riveted on it. Paris is a city which unfortunately has a lot of fires, often in low-income housing, often in older structures. I said churches because a lot of these churches are still built in wood. The roof that collapsed here in Notre-Dame, it was built with, thousands of oak trees, the wood from oak trees. So the absolutely most flammable product. Some people would tell you that if it weren't one of France's most holy monuments, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame, it would have been condemned long ago as a fire hazard.
Now, one of the things that we've been talking about here on France 24 is how Notre-Dame Cathedral, when it was struck with this fire, was actually in the midst of a huge renovation project costing tens of millions of euros, and that had been ongoing for months. Let's now take a look back at that renovation work that had been in the process with Nick Rushworth.
The cathedral, built between the 12th and 14th centuries, was in a state of disrepair. Renovation on the spire and other parts of the Gothic edifice was underway. Scaffolding was in place. Among the signs of the structure's fragility, some statues strapped in so that they would stay in place. Heritage experts warned of the scale of the task. Speaking to France 24 last June, the architect responsible for the cathedral's restoration explained that cement dating back to the 19th century was causing problems.
The stone is porous. The cement is rock solid, so solid that when water enters the masonry, it can only seep out through the stone and not the cement, so the stones are getting completely worn down and the cement seal remains intact.
A 100-meter-high crane was used several days ago to remove 16 statues from the spire as part of the restoration. They were to be put back in several years' time. They are now what remains intact of the spire. The cathedral, over its 8.5 centuries, has been hit by fire before. This one is devastating.
Now, I'm sure for many of you who watch France 24, who love France, you've been here yourselves, you've been to Notre-Dame Cathedral. It is the most visited site here in France. Some 13 million tourists come through its doors every year. And to talk a bit more about the effect that this devastation, this fire may have on the tourism is Brian Quinn from our business desk. Brian, thanks so much for coming in. This cathedral has really been a pillar of a rebounding tourism industry we've seen here in France.
That's right, Genie. And in fact, as you mentioned, anywhere from 13 to 15 million visitors per year here in France. Not just the most visited monument in France, but in fact, I think in all of Europe. Some 50,000 people a day at peak hours pass through there, and it's really been a big draw for what's been a resurging tourism industry in France. 2018 saw some new record numbers after a bit of a dip in 2017. France, of course, is still the most visited country in the world. But the tourism sector has shown that it's not immune to disruptions. The Yellow Vest protest movement, as we've seen this past December, believed to have caused about a 5% drop in tourism here in Paris, about 3% in the country on the whole. So it remains to be seen really what kind of impact that this fire is going to have on tourism here in Paris. You would imagine that there would be some. It's a bit too early to tell right now.
And of course, Paris had already been suffering in regards to tourism after the terror attacks, of course, in 2013 that left 130 people dead. Now, we're still waiting to hear about the investigation to know what exactly was the cause of this fire, but there is a theory that it could be linked to that restoration work that was going on at the time, and that too was a very costly affair.
That's right. The cathedral had just really begun a huge multi-decade, hundreds of $1 million worth of renovation projects. The Archdiocese Foundation, the Friends of Notre-Dame in 2017 estimated that project was going to cost about $100 million over the next, 100 million euros over the next 20 years, with another 50 million euros added on for the following decades, so up to about 150 million euros there. Financing all that had been precarious, to say the least. Like all churches here in France, Notre-Dame is owned by the French state, which then licenses its use to the Catholic Church. Now, the French state puts in about 2.2 million euros a year for upkeep. That is not enough to fund those repairs. So it bumped up that amount to 4 million in recent years, and the Archdiocese is expected to come up with the rest of that 6 million, which it mostly did through patronage, donations, but it was definitely a tight squeeze. Now, there's been some argument over the responsibility between the state and the church, who should pay for it, because obviously this is not just a Catholic religious site. It's part of the heritage of the Republic of France as well, as we've seen. It's very important. So, and in fact, there's even a secularist law from 1905 that prevents French churches from charging admission as they do in other countries, which perhaps could have alleviated some of the budget strains at Notre-Dame. So obviously the investigation has just begun. Don't want to speculate too much, but if it turns out that the renovation had something to do with the fire, there will probably be questions as to whether budget constraints may have affected the safety precautions taken.
Right, and of course, just coming off the back of that, if Notre-Dame is perhaps the most visited tourist site in Paris, it was because it was free of entry. Of course, the most visited paid tourist site is the Eiffel Tower. Now, of course, in the wake of this devastation, we're looking at a huge new renovation project, but already there have been pledges of money.
That's true. I think it's safe to say it's no longer a renovation. It's essentially a rebuilding of the inside now. Too early to estimate the cost. You would imagine if the renovation was going to be 150 million, you could easily double or triple that for the rebuilding of the inside. Now, fortunately, as you say, there are a lot of pledges already rolling in. Aside from the president's, you launched a national fundraising drive last night outside the cathedral. We've seen a number of pledges already come in. Ile-de-France, the Greater Paris region, has unlocked 10 million euros just for the most urgent work in the first days here. Paris itself, Mayor Anne Hidalgo, says that the city is going to unlock 50 million euros right away. But that's just to get started. We've seen sort of a battle of the billionaires here in France of who's pledging more. François-Henri Pinault, he's the CEO of a luxury group Kering, says his family is pledging 100 million euros. You got Bernard Arnault, who's one of the most famous billionaires in France, runs LVMH, pledging 200 billion euros. Now we've actually just heard recently from the CEO of French oil giant Total that their company is pledging 100 million euros. So right there, we're up in the 450, 460 range. So you would say there is a lot of money pouring in for this already. As we've said, though, it's going to be a project that takes a lot of time. I've talked to some historical architects about this, and they say, depending on the damage to the vaulted roof, it will likely be at least years before visitors set foot in the cathedral again.
Years and possibly decades. Brian, thank you so much for that. That's Brian Quinn from our business desk. Well, let's take a look now at some reaction that's come in from around the world to the fire at Notre-Dame.
As Paris comes to terms with a historic fire at Notre-Dame Cathedral, messages of sympathy and solidarity have arrived from around the world. In a tweet posted in French, Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte called the fire a blow to the heart for French people and for all of us Europeans. The Vatican said it learned with disbelief and sadness about the fire, which broke out in the run-up to Easter Sunday, the holiest week of the year for Christians. Notre-Dame is also the most visited monument of Europe, attracting some 12 million visitors each year. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the cathedral, which dates to the 12th century, is a symbol of European culture. As Japan awoke to the news of the blaze, A spokesman for the government said it was ready to provide help.
Notre-Dame Cathedral is a World Heritage Site. And if there is some kind of request for support from the French government, the Japanese government will actively consider that.
Governments across Latin America also expressed sympathy. From Costa Rica to Brazil, whose President Jair Bolsonaro offered prayers to the French people. With the flames still burning, U.S. President Donald Trump said it was horrible to watch the massive fire and suggested firefighters use flying water tankers. That prompted a response from French firefighting authorities, who warned the use of water-bombing aircrafts could result in the collapse of the entire structure of the cathedral.
You're watching France 24, and this is our ongoing live coverage here in front of Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame Cathedral, as it's known to so many people around the world. A cathedral that stood for 800 years, but that last night, in the space of just a few hours, saw almost its entire roof devastated by flames and its spire that was toppled to the ground. France 24's Haxi Myers-Belkin is out on the streets speaking to people in front of Notre Dame, trying to get a better idea about what this devastation means to them. Haxi, to you.
Thanks, Julie. Yes, I'm stood at the Parvis de Notre-Dame, the large square in front of the cathedral, just in front of those two bell towers that were miraculously spared by the worst of the flames. And I'm joined by who is the conductor.
Okay. Sorry about that. We do seem to be having some trouble with Haxi Myers-Belkin. Sorry about that. We do seem to be having some trouble with Haxi Myers-Belkin. We'll try and get back to her a little bit later if we can in the program now. In the meantime, let's take a look back at the centuries of which Notre-Dame Cathedral has been here standing proud in the heart of Paris, and what that's meant to France and to the world over the years.
An iconic symbol of Paris that contains within its walls over 850 years of history and priceless works of art. Notre-Dame de Paris is famed for its Gothic facade, carved stone and stained glass windows. Construction began in 1163 and took 200 years to build. It's not just a piece of history, but where history was made. It's where generations of leaders had their coronations, including King Henry VI as a young boy in 1429 and Napoleon in 1804. It inspired beloved French writer Victor Hugo to write the classic novel The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and it's where Joan of Arc was made a saint at the beginning of the 20th century. Images of the spire collapsing shocked Paris on Monday, and it isn't the first time it's fallen. The French Revolution plundered the treasures of the cathedral and the spire was taken down. Statues of biblical kings were mistaken for royal kings and destroyed. The wood and lead spire that burnt today was a replacement built during a renovation in the 1850s. Throughout the centuries, the cathedral has been made, broken, and remade.
Here we are still live at the Pont de la Tournelle, just a stone's throw from Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame Cathedral, the victim of that horrific fire last night that burned for several hours, burning 2/3 of the roof, causing immeasurable damage and making the iconic spire fall. And to talk a bit more about all of this with me now, I'm joined by Marie Segura. Thanks, Marie, for coming to see us.
Thank you.
You are the owner of My Private Paris, a tour guide group here in the French capital. What went through your head when you first heard that Paris' Notre-Dame Cathedral was burning?
It was a nightmare. I couldn't believe it. Like all the Parisians, Notre-Dame is our heart. And when we saw the very first picture and first images, we were thinking it can't happen. And when I saw also all the part of the roof just falling apart, I couldn't believe it, really. And just watching it was it was irreal, really. Just can't have any word for it, you know.
And you give tours, or have given tours in the past, of Notre Dame. Why do you think it is such an important thing for so many people, not just here in France, but for all of the millions of tourists who come to Paris?
It is the most visited monument in France, so it's for Parisians it's so important. But of course, it's also the most magnificent building that we have from the Gothic art. There is so much history in it. I mean, Napoleon and the wars. I mean, everything that happened here. So, of course, the people are touched, even if they're not Catholic. They are touched by the impressive monument and all this beauty, and also the fact that so many workers, artisans, actually work on it, and yeah, so many centuries after that, we still have it, you know. And so, yeah, I think for everyone it's touching in any level.
Marie, take us back a bit. When Notre-Dame Cathedral was first built, it was an incredibly long process that began almost 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So the very first stone was in 1163 and took almost 200 years to finish it. So you have to imagine all the generation of workers working on it. And when it's finished, then we added those beautiful rose windows that are just magnificent still today. And we really hoped yesterday that they were untouched, because that's something that, yeah, we are very attached to.
And Notre-Dame Cathedral has also had a huge cultural significance here in France and around the world, not only with books, but also through musicals, songs, movies.
Yeah, of course, you know, Notre-Dame de Paris, it's one of my favorite books, and it's the same probably for all the French people. This story about Notre-Dame is not really about the Bossu, it's not really about Esmeralda, it's really about the monument itself. It's happening all around. So yeah, it's in any literature, history, all the domains are really around Notre-Dame. So that's, yeah.
Is it true that when Victor Hugo wrote the book, Notre-Dame, it brought a sort of renaissance to the cathedral?
Oh, completely. People at the time, they kind of wanted to take that down because it was in a very bad shape after the French Revolution. A lot of stones were out. So we were thinking, should we put a lot of money into that? And it's really thanks to Victor Hugo's book that now we have a beautiful, we had a beautiful monument, and yeah, so it really helped this book. It saved the cathedral almost, yeah.
And Notre-Dame also, for those of you who've actually been here to Paris to see Notre-Dame Cathedral, there is a stone right in front of it that marks the very heart of France.
Yeah, exactly. We call that le point zéro des routes de France. It's a very symbolic place where you're in the middle and you feel like you're in the center of France, and it's something very special, and it's just in front of the most beautiful church, a cathedral of France. So yeah, it is symbolically, when you're there, you feel something special. You feel like you're someone special being here. Yeah.
Marie, how do you as a tour guide see the visits to Paris, the tours of Paris going forward? I know my own daughter was meant to go on a field trip to Notre-Dame on Wednesday. They're still going to maintain it. They want to persist and have the children learn about Notre-Dame, good and bad. Is that what you'll do too?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the facade and the goggles and everything around is still there, and we're very lucky for that. And so this morning I was looking at it and thinking, yeah, we should continue just sharing everything we can about it, and maybe people will help us with donation. Maybe it's going to, help France also to rebuild this beautiful cathedral. So yeah, of course we're going to continue. I just hope the people will still come and want to see her.
I'm sure they will. And what's so wonderful about Paris, and this is something that we saw a lot in the wake of the terror attacks of 2013, there's the motto of the city, and excuse me, I know I'm going to get it wrong, but say it for me. What is it?
It's fluctuat nec mergitur, which
basically means we're rocked, we're shaken, but we're not sunk, and that goes with the symbol of Paris, which is a boat, correct?
Exactly. And when you see the cathedral being surrounded by the Seine, it makes more sense, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marie Segura, for coming in to speak to us. You're the owner of My Private Paris. You're our tour guide. Thank you so much. Well, France 24's Haxie Myers-Belkin is also now in front of the Notre-Dame Cathedral out on the Parvis, what we call that main square in front of Notre-Dame. Let's go live to her, Haxie.
Hi, Genie. So I am on the Parvis, the large square in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral. The ground around me covered in soot and ash. It's quite a disconcerting sight. I'm joined here on the Parvis de Notre-Dame by Gabriel Chernik, who's the conductor of the I Dodici choir, which performed inside the Notre-Dame Cathedral on Monday morning, just hours before disaster struck. Thank you so much for speaking to us here on France 24. Could you start by telling us just what it was like performing it inside such an extraordinary place?
So then, when you think of places to sing for choirs and for religious services, sort of three places really stick out. In my mind, you have the St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City, and you have St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and you have the Notre-Dame. It's, for us, an incredible honour to have been able to perform in such an amazing building with such a rich and vibrant history of choral singing and worship.
And what did it feel like actually performing, standing there with your choir?
Rather overwhelming, actually. There was a moment, I did take a moment during the performance to turn around and really kind of take it in and see just the vast scale of the building and the wonderful acoustic it's in, and also the sort of hundreds of tourists who kind of just happened to be walking in as we were performing and took the time to stop and listen. So we feel very privileged to have been there at all, actually.
So what were your first reactions when you heard that Notre-Dame Cathedral had caught flames just hours after you performed there?
Well, we were devastated. I think we all sort of got quite emotionally involved, and it's a beautiful building, and we had just been there only hours before, so it was quite surreal. In particular, as after the fire had started, we were walking around and we tried to get a look for ourselves, and we saw a large crowd of people right up against the red tape, singing hymns as the firefighters were tackling the blaze, and it was a really moving image, I think, for all of us. We were quite sad.
So this building is, of course, over 850 years old, hugely important for France's cultural heritage, religious heritage, of course, but also musical heritage.
Yeah, and one of the pieces of news that I think we've just heard is that the organ was quite badly damaged, which is a real shame, particularly as it's going to be out of action. The whole area around the Notre-Dame is going to be out of action for this week, for Holy Week. The organ is the sort of centrepiece for the choir and the centrepiece of a service, and particularly the congregational aspect. So when the congregation stands and sings hymns, it's led by the organ, and this organ has been doing that for over 850 years. And if it can't do that anymore, that's a really significant loss.
Well, here's hoping that restoration will manage to restore it to its former glory. Absolutely. Gabriel Chernek, director of the I Dodici Choir, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us here on France 24. Genie, back to you.
Haxi, thank you so much. Haxi Myers-Belkin there reporting for us from out in front of Notre-Dame de Paris, Notre-Dame Cathedral. I'm joined now here by Alexandre Meyer. You're the editor-in-chief of L'Invisible, a Catholic magazine. Tell us a bit more about your reactions when you first heard that Notre-Dame Cathedral was burning.
Well, when my friends and relatives who live just in the neighborhood told me yesterday night and sent me pictures and videos of this, I couldn't believe it. Truly, I couldn't believe it. Then I opened my windows, saw the smoke, and it was like everything collapsed, And at first I was full of sorrow. We, the Parisians, French, Catholics, non-Catholics, believers, and those who do not, we are deep and sunk into this river of sorrow today. But then there is hope, there is light. When I heard this story of a modern hero, this priest who is a firefighter, who led his squadron inside the cathedral to remove the treasury, the most sacred treasury of Notre-Dame, and keep it safe. The crown of Jesus Christ, most of the chalices and these sort of things. I was like enlightened in all this darkness. And now there is, yes, hope that everything will be rebuilt quite rapidly. And when I see all those people massed all around, it's like, yes, fraternity in action.
That was also something that we saw last night. Again, images that we were broadcasting on France 24, where we saw people praying in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral, singing.
Yes, absolutely. They were singing all the prayers they know, all the Ave Maria, Salve Regina they may know, for hours. And I know that the Archbishop of Paris, when he went out of all the studios and the press conferences he was heading, he stepped there with them, prayed with them, blessed them, and remained silent a few moments with them. Because the heart of the Catholic Church here in France is there with these people who are praying for their house, who are praying for their treasury, who are praying for this place that all the world is having his sight and his eyes deepen into it. And it's like, if it was the church of the global village who is burning in front of us.
Alexandre, do we know a bit more? We know that the relics, they said, were saved. Do we know where they are, if they will be brought out as per usual in this Easter week?
I hope so. Maybe in the church Saint-Sulpice, which is big enough to gather all the people who want to pray in front of them. Right now they are in the City Hall of Paris, just on the other side of the river Seine. and I'm sure they are kept in good secrecy and safe, yes, until Friday.
Alexandre Mayer, thank you so much for speaking to us. You're the editor-in-chief of L'Invisible, a Catholic magazine here in France. Alexandre was mentioning that one firefighter amongst the 400 who was a priest who helped fight the flames yesterday. Let's now take a closer look at the 400 firefighters who all turned out as a group to save Notre-Dame Cathedral. Solemn applause in the small hours to honor the 400 firefighters who worked throughout the night, risking their lives to put out the flames which engulfed Notre Dame. Battling smoke and falling drops of molten lead, initially they fought the flames from inside the cathedral, rushing to save relics and artwork.
With much courage, they entered the towers to battle the blaze from the inside and prevent them from collapsing. If they hadn't intervened, they probably would have collapsed. So I once again want to hail the bravery and determination of these firefighters who risked their lives.
One firefighter was seriously injured, the only reported casualty. A centuries-old crown of thorns and the tunic worn by Saint Louis were saved. The crowds lining the streets expressed their gratitude.
I heard they managed to save the treasures of Notre-Dame, the crown of thorns, the holy relics, which were inside before the spire collapsed. So I'm not that sad. Because for me, that's the most important thing, that they managed to save them. It's remarkable.
When it became apparent the spire was going to fall, firefighters turned their attention to the outside, sending a robot into the blazing altar. At one point on Monday evening, authorities warned Notre Dame might be beyond saving. But with the firefighters' efforts, the main structure and facade were saved, inspiring hope for many at the dawn of a dark night for Paris. A look there at some of the 400 firefighters who turned out last night to help douse the flames that engulfed the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral. Firefighters who did an incredible amount of work, something that some other firefighters have commented later, saying that it was really unheard of how they went in and were able to battle those flames when they were dealing with all of that wood, particularly of those 12th century beams that made up what was just underneath the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral. Doug Herbert is still with me here to talk a bit more about all of this. And Doug, you were saying what's so incredible about Notre-Dame Cathedral is that over 8 centuries, that it's been here, towering over Paris, it has seen so many awful times.
Yeah, generations have come and gone, and those sentinels, those towers are still standing, and fortunately still standing after the fire. This is basically the cathedral that has been a stage set for French history. Anything that has happened anytime, anywhere, in France, in Paris, this has been the epicenter. Emmanuel Macron was not, it wasn't hyperbole when he said last night that Notre Dame is basically the epicenter of our lives. It literally is at the central, even for French who may have never physically stepped foot in Notre Dame. It's still so much a part of the patrimony, a part of sort of all of the legends of France. It's the place, as we said, where the kings and queens were often married, where they were then subsequently buried in the crypts below the cathedral. It's the place where Napoleon I sort of crowned himself, took the crown and put it on his head. And perhaps more recently, it was also where the liberation of Paris, it was the epicenter of the ceremonies, the original ceremonies with Charles de Gaulle. There are stories that, in August 1944, just as Paris was being liberated and the French armored brigades were rolling in with their tanks right down there in front of the 2 towers, which you can't see in the shot behind us, you still had some snipers on the roofs of the surrounding buildings around Notre Dame. And Charles de Gaulle, a very tall man, was standing there about to go in to celebrate the victory of France. Snipers started shooting. A lot of other people either ran or hit the ground. He was apparently the only man still standing and walked slowly into the cathedral amid the sniper fire and for the celebration, which is a Te Deum and La Marseillaise. So it was also the place where France celebrated grandiosely its liberation from the Nazis. And that's just one moment in many throughout the history. So when French walk by it for any generation, everyone has stories associated with this cathedral. It is sort of knit very tightly and finely, woven into the fabric of French history.
It certainly is. Doug, thank you so much for that. Doug, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. In just a few minutes' time, we'll be back with more live coverage here of this fire that ravaged the roof of Notre-Dame de Paris. Just before, let's take a look at some of the images from last night.
It's burning so fast.
Everyone in the crowd here is very emotional. We're all very upset. A part of our heritage is burning down at this very moment. There are no words. I can't even describe what's happening right now. Paris is collapsing.
Il y a plus de 800 ans,
more than 800 years ago, we knew how to build it.
Et à travers les
And over the
siècles,
centuries, we grew and improved on
et
it.
l'améliorer. Alors je vous le dis très
So tonight,
solennellement ce soir,
I tell you solemnly,
cette
we will
cathédrale, nous la
rebuild this
rebâtirons.
cathedral together.
Tous ensemble.
It's one of the world's most visited monuments, so it's not just about old stones. It represents values and so many other things.
C'est des valeurs, c'est beaucoup de choses.
You are watching France 24. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes with more live coverage from Notre-Dame de Paris.
Arctic is going to be exploited, and the scale of this exploitation will only grow.
We have a beautiful planet, we need to protect it, and we can use space exploration to better understand it.
Now we've moved from, is that real, to what do we do about it?
Join us on Down to Earth, where we explore the incredibly complex relationship between humans and our planet. We're here to ask the tough questions and find answers that may just surprise you.
Down to Earth on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24, a different point of view.
You are watching France 24. You're watching France 24 with our continuing live coverage in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral here in Paris, in the heart of the French capital, a cathedral that has stood for 800 years. And yet last night, starting at about 7 p.m. local time, a fire broke out in the roof of Notre-Dame de Paris, a fire that went on to destroy 2/3 of the entire roof of this iconic cathedral, bringing down its spire that has stood over all of the French capital for centuries now. That iconic spire that went down to gasps from people, the hundreds of people who were lining the Seine, watching it as it fell down into nothing. Now, earlier today here in Paris, the Culture Minister and the Deputy Interior Minister gave a press conference just to give us the very latest on the damage from the fire last night. Let's listen.
The north, south and west rose windows have not, from what we know at this point, been extensively damaged. The vault should continue to hold up. We have to be really careful. There are 3 big holes. Overall, the cathedral structure is holding. Some weaknesses have been identified in the vault, and with the north transept's gable, which has to be made safe. Safety work inside Notre-Dame will take around 48 hours. Once that's completed, people will be able to enter to recover works of art, most of which have not been damaged.
Those comments there from the press conference earlier today here in Paris in the wake of that devastating fire at Notre-Dame de Paris. With me now here is Lindsay Tremuta. Hi, Lindsay.
Hi.
Now, Lindsay, you're an American journalist based here in Paris. You're also the author of the book, The New Paris. What went through your mind when you were the first one, I think, who I heard it from, that Paris was quite literally burning?
I mean, you're sort of suspended in disbelief. I mean, I felt that way all evening. You kind of can't believe that something like this could happen. I mean, we're in 2019, and sure, this is an 800-year-old structure, but you kind of think it's forever going to be there. You don't ever doubt its longevity. And here it was, ablaze. And I think there was just the sense that something was being ripped from the city, from the people. And that's sort of the sentiment that stayed with me all evening. Then I saw the images of people singing in the streets and clapping and coming together in this beautiful, peaceful way. And it just felt, I mean, it was moving, it was sad, it was sort of all the emotions you could imagine feeling when something like this, which seems to represent, I mean, more than a religious structure, but really, you know, the heart of this city in such a way.
And more than that, I mean, for many people who live in this neighborhood or not far afield, I mean, we could see the flames billowing across all of Paris for hours.
Yeah, from my window, and I live in the 11th arrondissement, I could see the smoke. So, you know, I think people from various different vantage points could at least feel that something was happening. And there was also, it was at sunset, and there was this sort of eerie, beautiful quality as well, which just only confuses sort of the emotions you're going through when you're trying to process something like this.
And something that also struck me being an expat here, and I'm sure it was the same for you, was how quickly this news spread around the world.
It was instantaneous. And I mean, I recall this from various other incidents that have happened in the city, the way it unfolds on Twitter. I think, luckily, this time, people sort of waited to see the official reports before any conjecture about the source. So there was, but there was just collective disbelief, and that took off, I mean, just as quickly as the fire itself did. And I think it's a testament to what people feel for this monument, not just the city, but what it represents beyond religion, beyond history. I mean, there's this, it's sort of anchored in our collective imagination, probably through centuries of literature and art and its depictions in movies. I mean, it's been in countless movies. And I think all of that, even for people who have never been here before, feel an affection and an attachment that they may not even have been aware they even had until something like this happens.
Right, and it's not, I mean, it really doesn't speak to France specifically. It's something that does speak to the world.
And look at the week we're in. This is the Holy Week. I think the city was going to see swarms of people for the Easter holiday. And so there is this sort of poignant and somber symbolism that this happens now. And it's a holy site like many others, but it's also a cultural touchstone for Paris, and that goes beyond borders.
Have you had a chance yourself to walk around to get closer to Notre-Dame?
I haven't yet. This is my first stop, and then I do plan to stroll, and I think there's something very bittersweet about it. I mean, of course, it's going to survive, rebuild. It's going to be rebuilt, but it won't be the same. And I think that's something we all need to grieve. That there will be renovations, but you can't replace the history that we've lost. And maybe that's okay, but we can't pretend that this is going to be exactly as it was.
But it is very interesting here in Paris. I was mentioning before, of course, Paris that survived those horrific terror attacks in 2013. But Paris is also very much, in my mind, a survivor city.
I think that's exactly how I would call it. There's a resiliency that we don't necessarily feel from other cities. And certainly the world is looking to Paris as a place of incredible strength and resilience. And I think it's because of its history. I mean, it survived so many other things from generations past. And it just, unfortunately, it feels like we're just in a fragile state. Ever since 2015, I think we're all a bit on edge, and so something like this happens and we start to relive the feelings that we felt 3 years ago, and that, I mean, that will continue to allow Paris to remain a survivor city for sure, and its people, but I do think it's a result of everything we've been through.
Lindsay, thank you so much for coming in to speak to us. Lindsay Tremuta, an American journalist who is based here in France, also the author of The New Paris. If you're just joining us, this is our continuing coverage of the fire that racked Notre-Dame de Paris, the cathedral that has stood in the French capital for over 800 years. Let's take a look back at what exactly happened when the fire broke out last night.
It survived the French Revolution, 2 world wars, and now a massive fire. Notre-Dame Cathedral is still standing and the worst has been avoided. 2/3 of the roof and the spire have collapsed, but the main structure, including the 2 bell towers, has been saved. Firefighters battled the blaze for more than 8 hours. They say the situation is finally under control. The roof of the 12th century monument caught fire shortly before 7 p.m. local time. It quickly spread into a towering inferno, with flames and thick yellowish smoke billowing into the sky, engulfing one of the cathedral's landmark rectangular towers. Nearby buildings were evacuated as fears mounted that the entire structure would collapse. A few minutes later, the cathedral's spire came down. A moment seared into the memory of horrified onlookers.
There are no words. I can't even describe what's happening right now. Paris is collapsing.
It's horrible, especially when we saw the spire collapse.
It's a catastrophe.
As news sunk in, Parisians and tourists congregated around the cathedral to see the sight with their own eyes. Some struggling to hold back tears, others singing hymns or saying prayers.
It's very sad. It's one of the great monuments of France. I live not far away. It's devastating to see a monument like this burn.
Visiting the scene after cancelling a major speech on TV, French President Emmanuel Macron praised the courage of the 500 firefighters deployed on site, one of whom was badly injured.
Over centuries, the cathedral has been improved and changed, and so I say to you very solemnly this evening, this cathedral will be rebuilt. It is part of our destiny as France and our project for the years to come.
Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo, meanwhile, praised the city's solidarity in coming together to save the cathedral's works of art and objects of worship.
A human chain immediately sprung into place. First, the firefighters who do incredible work. Then also a chain of solidarity, especially in saving the artworks.
The 850-year-old church was undergoing renovation when the fire broke. Prosecutors have now opened an investigation to determine what may have caused it.
Here we are on the Pont de la Tournelle. We're just in front of Notre-Dame de Paris, the cathedral that last night suffered from almost 6 hours of non-stop flames that destroyed 2/3 of the cathedral's roof. It also brought down its iconic spire. With me is Doug Herbert, who's been with me since the beginning of this live special on France 24. And Doug, let's talk a bit more about the investigation. What more do we know about the causes, what might have started this fire?
Well, perhaps the good news for a lot of Parisians, used to, accustomed to some tragic news, is they believe it's an accidental fire. They do not think it's criminal. They are not right now looking at arson as a cause. And the reason that they are looking at the hypothesis of an accident is that, as you can see in that scaffolding behind us, this is a cathedral that has been under a nearly year-long renovation right now. There have been workers going in and out almost daily, trying basically, ironically, to remove lead from that very spire, which is now gone, which you no longer see in your television frame there. A lot of those workers were using soldering tools. They were welding. It's possible, and once again, it's all speculation at this point until they're able to really start a full-fledged investigation, that a spark from one of their welding instruments actually flew onto one of the beams. There are a lot of the origin of this fire was at the top of what's in an area called the attic in the transept. A lot of wooden beams there, all wooden, highly flammable material, oak wood as well, dry. So it would have been easy for even a tiny spark to perhaps fall onto one of the wooden framework, the charpente as it's called in French, and to even smolder there for a while and start to build up before anything was noticed. I believe the first fire incident was signaled around 6:20 p.m. Last night, but it wasn't really until about maybe 25 minutes later where people really began to see, at least the public, especially on the outside, the signs of real smoke and that the spire all of a sudden, that bright red and orange color, and all of a sudden literally turning to cinder before it collapsed, and the smoke billowing through the Paris skies. But once again, that investigation at this point is they say it's probably accidental and looking at perhaps tragically an accident that happened during this renovation, during this restoration project.
And Doug, there were 400 fighters who were battling these flames. It took almost 6 to 8 hours to put them out. Why was it so hard to put this fire out?
Well, first of all, look at the cathedral behind me. Soaring cathedral. The spire itself was 300 feet, 93 meters. Very hard to reach places in the cathedral. These vaulted arches, Notre Dame was once for many centuries, was the tallest edifice in Paris. Even today, yes, it's been sort of dwarfed by a lot of other more modern monuments, but it's still a pretty impressive and soaring structure. And the nature of its architecture makes things extremely hard to reach. You couldn't just pour water from the sky, from helicopters, as some people suggested you might do it. The structure would have been too vulnerable, and trying to hoist hoses and cranes was also very problematic given the architecture, given the structure. You can't really reach up there. As it was, you had 400 firefighters with 18 hose instruments trying to reach and trying to train the water up into very difficult to reach areas, which is why, as you rightly pointed out, they were literally battling to try to control this blaze through the night. It wasn't really until 10 o'clock this morning, Paris time, that we got the announcement that they had extinguished the final flames, because even after the flames were no longer visible, it is such a complex structure. There's so much wood. There are so many vaulted, buttressed arches there. It's called the forest. There are so many of these arches that it would have been possible that a fire still could have been smoldering somewhere without necessarily seeing it, without knowing. So they had to do a meticulous inspection of that entire area where the fire had broken out and extended in order to be absolutely sure that they really had extinguished it.
Doug, thank you so much for that. Haxi Myers-Belkin has also been speaking to many tourists who have turned out here again to take a look at the damage from the fire last night. We'll go live to her. Haxi.
Hi, Genie. Yes, so I'm on the rive gauche, the left bank of the Seine, just opposite the Notre-Dame Cathedral, or at least, of course, what remains of it. It's really extraordinary. Throngs of people here, many of them coming down to see for themselves exactly what that devastating fire did to one of the world's most recognisable monuments. I spoke to one man. He said that he was deeply moved, heartbroken even, to see Notre-Dame in the state that it's currently in. I'm not sure if you can see, but that scaffolding that has come to be such a common feature of the Paris skyline in recent months, really covering a void. That's what's really extraordinary about this site from this particular vantage point. I spoke to one man who said he was really in a state of disbelief. He said that he couldn't quite believe how it was that such a famous, important monument wasn't being guarded by firefighters 24/7. He said that without a doubt, once the construction is completed, and he said this construction has to be completed, he said firefighters should be on call at all times of day and night. I also spoke to a woman who said that this cathedral was particularly important for her because it was her grandmother's favourite cathedral. Her grandmother met her future husband in what was then French Indochina. She said that when she arrived in France, the one thing she wanted to do was come to Notre-Dame Cathedral because for her this was a symbol of Paris, a symbol of France, a symbol of her new life. I also spoke to one man who said that one of the reasons this spectacle was so shocking was the kind of divine implications it had for him. He was a Catholic. He wondered whether or not that extraordinary inferno signified the end of the world. Really a huge amount of sadness, of shock. I've been picking up on here on the left bank of the Seine, just opposite a truly transformed Notre-Dame Cathedral.
Haxi Myers-Belkin there reporting from out in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral. I'm joined now here by Jean Duchesne. You're the special advisor to the Archbishop of Paris. Thank you so much for coming. What went through your mind when you saw these devastating images of the flames engulfing Notre-Dame?
Well, I was just speechless, just like everybody else. We feel now just a little like a family whose ancestral house has been destroyed, and because it is just part of ourselves. And at the same time, it is very powerful, it is very sad, but it's not time for mourning, it's also the time, it's fuel for thought. It is a reminder, so everybody is so moved, even non-believers. And this reminds us all that we're not just animals, we also have a soul. And that somehow our soul is something that is given to us, something that allows us to wonder where we come from, where we are going, and why we were allowed to build such magnificent things, and why it was allowed to disappear like this in one night in a fire.
Has there been reaction from the Pope, from other archbishops around the world?
Yes, the Pope immediately sent a message of support and expressing his own dismay. And there also have been hundreds of messages from archbishops all over the world, because the Cathedral of Paris is not only meaningful to the French, not only meaningful to the Parisians, of course, but also something worldwide as a reminder of history, a reminder of everything that faith can engender, can support, can produce. And our hope is that that faith is not dead, and that something like this, other things like this, more beautiful perhaps, will be built now.
And this is such a pivotal moment for this disaster to have happened. This is, of course, Holy Week in the run-up to Easter. This is a particularly important holiday in the life of Notre-Dame because it usually brings out the relics, the crown of thorns that's displayed on Friday. Do we know at all how that's going to play out, if that will be held somewhere else?
Well, it will be held somewhere else. I mean, I don't know where exactly it's been decided, but it certainly will be held. This will not prevent the Holy Week celebrations. Actually, of course, everything will be different. And what we have to remember is, see, the Holy Week is Easter morning, is the Easter sunrise, but it's also Good Friday. And it is also the time for mourning and the time for us to understand that everything that is given to us is so fragile.
The French President Emmanuel Macron is due to be speaking to Pope Francis later today. What do you think might come out of that conversation?
Well, actually, that President Macron will express, I suppose, the support of the French for everything that Notre-Dame represents. You know, this is not an isolated phenomenon. Everywhere in France, even in the small, remote, poorest, abandoned, deserted villages, people do their very best to maintain their church and to see to it that sometime, at least once a year, Mass is celebrated there. And what we are seeing here is perhaps what is going on in France, in the whole nation.
Jean Duchesne, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Jean Duchesne is Special Advisor to the Archbishop of Paris. Let's now take a closer look at some of the damages that came out of this horrific fire that hit Notre-Dame Cathedral last night.
Notre Dame is still standing, but the damage is extensive, according to France's junior interior minister, and doubts linger over how the structure will remain intact.
The structure has of course been saved, but we have to stay vigilant. We need to conduct assessments. A fire of this scale can have a significant impact on structures, so we need to make sure they're still stable, so that our firefighters are able to enter the cathedral once more.
Gone in the blaze that erupted Monday night, 2/3 of the cathedral's roof, along with its spire. But by Tuesday morning, the 2 bell towers remain, and Notre Dame's head priest said officials managed to save many of its relics.
We saved the crown of thorns from inside, as well as St. Louis' tunic. I think we saved some chalices. The treasure wasn't damaged.
Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo said the city would lend a helping hand.
Since we're neighbours with Notre-Dame, we immediately offered to store the artworks in the Paris Town Hall, in the Saint-Jean room, where we usually hold exhibits. This was to safeguard these paintings, these artworks, and of course, the crown of thorns and the Saint Louis tunic, which are also in a safe place.
Photos after the fire showed the extent of roof damage and a cross still in place at the altar. While the state of Notre Dame's stained glass windows remains unclear, 16 statues once connected to the spire are safe. They were removed as part of renovations last week.
Anne Le Breton is the number 2 at the mayor's office at the 4th arrondissement in Paris. Of course, that is the arrondissement of Notre-Dame de Paris. Anne Le Breton, thank you so much for coming on. What were your thoughts when you first saw those horrible pictures of Notre-Dame in flames?
Well, I was there and saw it happen, and I cried, honestly, and I wasn't the only one crying. Everybody was just devastated. And it's going to be something that we're going to have to live with for a long time.
For a very long time. Do we have an idea yet at all about the renovations, the restoration that we now can try and put into place?
Well, all we know, it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. And even the wood, I've been told the wood is the oak wood that is going to be necessary to rebuild the roof. We don't even have it. It doesn't even exist as a stock. It's so many, it's such an enormous amount of oaks. And so we're looking at a long process to redo it. And, we've started asking for donations, and we've already had, I think, 350 million, and we're going to need more money than that. And I think it is going to be an international appeal. So I appeal to you, because I know that you have a lot of foreign viewers. And everybody, Notre-Dame doesn't only belong to Paris or the 4th arrondissement or the France. It also belongs to the whole of humanity, and it's, Quasimodo. And so we, anyway, it's, yesterday we were even thinking there was going to be nothing left of it, because it was a time where we thought maybe the 2 front towers, one of them started catching on fire, and we thought if it collapsed, it would collapse onto the other one. And we were afraid of, looking at a scenario where we would only have stone rubble this morning. So this morning when I came and I saw that, from the front it almost looks normal. From the side it looks like Notre-Dame at least there is something of its presence that, on the landscape, it still looks a bit like Notre-Dame.
And so much of that can be thanks to the 400 firefighters who battled so valiantly overnight.
Yes, I just heard one next to you, and what he said was amazing. There was so much tactics, so much strategy. I'm getting a lot of messages. Why didn't you put air cannons above? Well, you can't. It's too fragile. The structures, the stones are laid one on top of each other without any mortar. It's not the kind of structure that you can put any weight on, and water is very heavy. And if we had done that, we would have had, everything would have collapsed.
Tell us a bit more about what Notre-Dame represents more specifically to the 4th arrondissement of Paris, this area where we are right here.
Well, we never really thought about it. It's like the central landmark. We see it all the time. Wherever we go, we see it. You see it from very far away when you come from the east of Paris, from the 13th and the 12th arrondissement. It's just the heart of Paris. We measure distances in France. This is the 0 kilometer. That's where we start all measures for anywhere in France. So, we never ever thought that it would go. It has resisted Second World War and all kinds of other terrible things. And
would you say that Paris, we were speaking with another guest earlier, that Paris is a bit of a survivor city? I mean, we saw the horrific terror attacks in 2015. What is it about Paris and Parisians that makes them go on in the face of such devastation?
Well, first of all, our motto is fluctuat nec mergitur, that we float, we never drown. And I think in times like that, that's what people think. They just go on. This is it's a big city. It's like New York, Big cities have a life of their own, and they find the energy to just continue. And so we're going to be working very hard, the whole country, to rebuild Notre-Dame for all the tourists in the world. And meanwhile, you can still come to Paris because we have millions of museums, and the Quai de la Seine are still there, and the trees are still in flower. My son took a picture of that tree that you see next to Notre-Dame last week, and he sent it to me. And this morning I noticed the tree was still there with its flowers. So,
Paris goes on.
Paris goes on.
Anne Le Breton, thank you so much for speaking to us. So you're the deputy mayor for the 4th arrondissement in Paris, which of course is the arrondissement where Notre-Dame is situated and where we are right now. Anne Le Breton was talking a bit more about tourism here in France and the effect that Notre-Dame has had on tourists over the years and the centuries. Let's take a look.
It's one of the world's most famous tourist attractions. Now a charred ruin. Notre-Dame Cathedral has been a symbol of Paris for centuries, and many visitors to the French capital are sad to see the iconic building damaged.
It's really sad. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a part of history, and you never really want to lose that. I think that's, part of the culture and the essence of any country.
Everybody saw it on the news, so I normally go out for a run when I'm traveling, so I had to see it myself. And it's unfortunately to see it like this, but I'm glad that it's still standing.
It's the most visited historic monument in Europe. The church receives between 13 and 15 million visitors each year, up to 50,000 a day, more than its main rival, the Eiffel Tower. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, it was built in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its many visitors would come to admire the typical French Gothic architecture, the stained glass and rose windows, the steeple and the gargoyles, or to climb the towers to enjoy a panoramic view of Paris. But much of the building has now been devastated by the fire. The French president has vowed to restore Notre-Dame to its former glory. Paris's tourism industry is famous for its resilience. 2018 was a record year for visitor numbers, despite rail strikes and violent protests, helping make France the most visited country on Earth.
Well, as we keep telling you, of course, this horrific fire at Notre-Dame Cathedral happened right during Holy Week, the run-up to Easter celebrations for Catholics and for Christians around the world. To talk a bit more about that with me now, I'm joined by Pastor Scott Herr from the American Church in Paris. Scott, thank you so much for coming in on such a devastating day. And what did you think when you first heard of the fire?
Well, we were actually in the middle of our worship services that we have each night, and one of my colleagues, Victor, came up and showed me on his phone, and it just was like somebody kicked me in the stomach. I mean, it's devastating. It felt like 9/11 somehow for us, and so some of the staff were able to come down here. I was going to a concert of my sons at their high school, and it was just a lot of confusion. But let me just say this on behalf of the American Church in Paris community: we're heartbroken and just devastated by the loss of Our Lady, and are praying for Paris and all who grieve and loss. We will probably be doing something dramatic as a community to show our solidarity with the people of Notre-Dame community, and just know that we're praying for everybody here, as we go through this together. It's just really difficult.
Scott, I know you know Notre-Dame Cathedral well. If I'm not mistaken, you've actually taken part in a service there. Tell us a bit about the beauty of inside for those of us who are watching who maybe have never had a chance to be inside Notre-Dame.
Oh my gosh, well the rose windows of course are stunning, but every year we have an English-speaking service for Armistice Day, and that's been such a privilege. I mean, I remember hearing for the first time the Cantique for Jean Racine there, and it just overwhelming beauty to be part, not just as a tourist to walk in, which is also moving, but to be there when it's absolutely standing room only full and a worshiping community. It's absolutely glorious. And so I have a lot of memories there, just personally, but also as a part of the larger community. And it's, I mean, when you think of 850 plus years of worship going on every day, and so many memories of so many people, so many generations, it's so central to who the French people are, I mean, in many ways. And so a lot of history's been lost here today. And, you know, having said all of that, I mean, it's just tragic and so sad. I must share, I walk by Notre Dame almost every morning on my morning walks with my wife. And this morning I was walking by and just so sad to see that, I mean, there was still smoke coming from the ruins, but I heard church bells ringing. And it was maybe a sign that even New Life, Hope, Renovation for our city, for the church, can come even out of this devastating tragedy. That's our hope and prayer this Holy Week. Yeah.
And so many people from around the world have been talking about what happened here last night. I mean, we saw it on social media. So many people around the world have been talking about the devastation. We saw it on social media. We saw it on television. What is it about Notre Dame, do you think, that speaks so much, not just to the French, but to people around the world?
That's a good question. I think it's one of those, well, in our lives, a timeless place. You know, so much history has been captured there. And I think now, even with this loss, we pray that it will be rebuilt, as President Macron promised last night. And of course, I hope we'll all be able to contribute some way positively to that rebuilding. But it opens our hearts. It opens us up to the eternal, that this world is passing. You know, there's a lot that we think we assume is permanent. Like, I was actually watching Is Paris Burning, an old movie about Saturday night. And just for a moment, I imagined what would it have been like if General, Colditz would have given the order to destroy all these monuments. What if we didn't have Notre Dame? And then this happened, and it was just surreal, So it makes us think about, okay, what's really important? What do we really value? And I have this deep sense that the French will rise to the occasion. I don't think we've heard the last from Notre Dame, Our Lady. Yeah.
I agree. They've done it before. Scott, thank you so much for coming to speak to us. Pastor Scott Herr, the pastor of the American Church in Paris. Of course, there are going to be lots of donations that have already started pouring in from some big names in the fashion world. Many foundations and crowdfunding even has begun to try and raise money to try and help fix the devastation that you can see behind me. Let's take a closer look at the donations that are coming in.
People, even as they watched the blaze, wanted to help rebuild what is a jewel of French heritage. Several donor websites got into action. This is Notre-Dame de Paris, I Love You. There were hundreds of donations from dozens of countries within hours on the website. The French heritage organization, the Fondation du Patrimoine, is organizing a national donor campaign. The money given by French residents is 2/3 tax deductible. Some people are saying the deduction should be increased to 90%. France's wealthiest businessman, Bernard Arnault, offered 200 million euros, And François-Henri Pinault, whose group owns Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent, said he'd give 100 million euros. The Paris mayor, Anne Hidalgo, has proposed organising an international donor conference to coordinate pledges. Among international efforts, the New York-based French Heritage Society has launched a web page to raise money. Worldwide, the GoFundMe fundraising platform says dozens of campaigns connected to the cathedral fire have been launched. The reconstruction will be long. The cost is difficult to estimate to restore the monument to its former glory.
You're watching France 24. This is our continuing live coverage of that devastating fire that ripped through Notre-Dame Cathedral. You can see just behind me there, yesterday starting around 7 p.m. local time, that fire burning through to about 3 a.m. in the morning, devastating 2/3 of the roof of this cathedral that has stood for 850 years, also toppling that incredible, iconic spire that also came down in the flames. With me here is France 24's Doug Herbert. Doug, tell us a bit more about what the investigation has told us so far about just what started this fire.
Yeah, well, to be sure, they don't know, obviously. They're still investigating, but it's reassuring that at least one path that has been ruled out is criminal or arson, all but ruled out. What they are saying is much more likely at this point is that it was an accidental fire, tragically accidental, a result of some of the restoration and renovation work that is going on here. That's at least one hypothesis right now. A lot of that work involved soldering, welding, work obviously which generates sparks. Those sparks can obviously hit any part of the wooden framework, the oak wooden framework of this cathedral, and can smolder for quite a while. These can be, tiny infinitesimal sparks. The company that built the scaffolding that you can see behind us on Notre Dame says that none of its workers were present on the site at the time that the fire broke out, or at least was signaled, which is possible because even if it was caused by a spark, it could smolder for a long time before it actually builds up into a smoky, billowing type of smoke, and that those flames start to surge up through the spire, as we saw. I'll say the one piece of good news with this investigation, and they're obviously also investigating the superstructure, which does remain intact, as you can see by looking behind us. The towers, most of the facades of the transept are still intact, as well as possibly most of the altar as well. They are going to be checking the building for structural stability. They obviously, over the next 48 hours or so, want to make sure clearly that there aren't vulnerabilities, cracks, little fissures in the edifice, smoke damage that has perhaps weakened the overall structure, which could lead to some sort of collapse of further structure in the next couple of days. I'll say one other silver lining in this, and it's hard to find silver linings, obviously, is what was saved. The initial investigation showing that a lot, if not most, of the artworks within the cathedral were taken out of the cathedral by the firefighters. They are now in the Louvre Museum, where they're going to be dried out and restored. They're there for safekeeping. Also, perhaps the two most precious relics, artifacts in Notre Dame, the crown of thorns, originally believed to have been worn by Jesus before the crucifixion. That has been apparently saved, salvaged, as has been St. Louis' tune, the tunic, worn by the former King of France, Louis, when he accepted that crown of thorns. So those are massive, if you want to say, that's a massive piece of good news for those who relish and treasure this cathedral, and especially not just what we can see on the outside, but the richness and the patrimony on the inside.
Those relics that you were mentioning are relics that are often brought out, sometimes just once a year on Good Friday, concerning the crown of thorns. Do we have any idea at all, Doug, when Notre Dame may be open again to the public?
Wow, listen, I'm not saying it glibly. There's no rush. They want to do it right, properly. The good news here is that we have seen tragedies in the past, perhaps not on this scale, but with cathedrals. The Reims Cathedral, which at the early days of World War I was bombed by the Germans. It was then started the restoration in 1919. It wasn't until 20 years later, 20 years later, in the late 30s, that it reopened to the public. Now, Today, you could say that the restoration, the engineering methods, the renovation technology has advanced quite a bit since World War I. And luckily, fortunately, France is still home to a lot of experts and people who really have the expertise needed in this domain of restoring a medieval church. Because obviously a lot of the architecture and a lot of the craft work and handiwork that went into building this church originally, even though parts of it were replaced itself over the centuries, a lot of it is basically a bygone art, forgotten by a lot of the world. But France does have people who specialize in this, and I presume they are going to be called in and intensively over the next years. We're not talking weeks and months, obviously. We are talking a project of years. On the good side, on the rosy side, if you want to see, there's a lot of donations that have already been pledged, both online, but also by a lot of some of France's richest families and corporations are already pledging tens, if not hundreds of millions of euros in order to start to restore it sooner rather than later.
You were talking before about that 12th century roof, all the beams that were inside the attic, which is part of the reason why the roof burned so dramatically. Do we know a bit more about why it took so long for the fire to be put out? It took almost 7 hours.
Well, first of all, they wanted to be meticulous. First, there was in the initial hour or so, they had to try to control the flames. These were flames that were basically blazing and soaring up through a 93-meter, 300-foot spire, already at the top of a cathedral, which for many centuries was the tallest edifice in all of Paris. Very hard, as you can imagine, given all of the constraints of the architecture, the delicacy of having to deal with one of the icons of France's patrimony. You can't just charge in with hoses and go about it in any which way. It's as much an engineering and a firefighting, operation as it is sort of an operation in finesse and delicacy. So there was a lot of different elements to consider. Given that, it's actually pretty impressive how quickly these 400 firefighters were able to come, coordinate their efforts, because Notre-Dame has its own fire brigade actually based within the church itself. Presumably coordinating all of these efforts to get that fire under control. And what we're hearing this morning is that it really came down to 30 minutes, perhaps about half an hour, where if they had not been able to get those flames under control, we might not be seeing, our viewers might not be seeing the view they're looking at right now on their screens. That more vulnerabilities, especially those two north towers that you can see, could have been subject to the smoke damage, to the flames, could have crumbled. So if there's a bright side to this, it's that the work of the firefighters was, despite the fact it went on all through the night, it's incredible, remarkable that they were able, in relatively short time, short speed, to master this fire, to bring it under control, and then to also ensure that everything was put out. We only got that final word at 10 o'clock this morning, but as of this hour, we are being told by the Paris authorities that there is nothing still smoldering in that cathedral. So it's actually rather impressive, if you ask me, that they were able to get it under control, not really why it took them so long to do so.
Doug, thank you so much for that. Doug Dyer talking about some of those 400 firefighters who were working to put out the flames overnight at Notre-Dame Cathedral. Let's take a closer look at some of the work of the firefighters.
Solemn applause in the small hours to honor the 400 firefighters who worked throughout the night, risking their lives to put out the flames which engulfed Notre Dame. Battling smoke and falling drops of molten lead, initially they fought the flames from inside the cathedral, rushing to save relics and artwork.
With much courage, they entered the towers to battle the blaze from the inside and prevent them from collapsing. If they hadn't intervened, they probably would have collapsed. So I once again want to hail the bravery and determination of these firefighters who risked their lives.
One firefighter was seriously injured, the only reported casualty. A centuries-old crown of thorns and the tunic worn by St. Louis were saved. The crowds lining the streets expressed their gratitude.
I heard they managed to save the treasures of Notre-Dame, the crown of thorns, the holy relics, which were inside before the spire collapsed. So I'm not that sad. Because for me, that's the most important thing, that they managed to save them. It's remarkable.
When it became apparent the spire was going to fall, firefighters turned their attention to the outside, sending a robot into the blazing altar. At one point on Monday evening, authorities warned Notre-Dame might be beyond saving. But with the firefighters' efforts, the main structure and facade were saved, inspiring hope for many at the dawn of a dark night for Paris.
This is our continuing coverage of the fire that ravaged Notre-Dame Cathedral overnight here in Paris, in the heart of the French capital. Around 7 p.m. Local time yesterday, that fire broke out. Still no official confirmation on what might have started that fire, but the word is that it did come linked to the current restoration project that was underway. You can see behind me that scaffolding, that metal scaffolding that's still left from part of that restoration project that was underway, but no longer can we see the roof. 2/3 of it were destroyed, much of it made of wood, as well as that iconic spire that fell as well over Notre-Dame Cathedral last night. Well, France 24's Haxie Myers-Belkin has been talking to some of the many people who have turned out today to get a look at some of the damage that Notre-Dame Cathedral suffered last night. Haxie, to you.
Well, here on the left bank of the Seine, just opposite Notre-Dame Cathedral, throngs of people still turning up to see for themselves the damage wrought by that extraordinary fire that broke out on Monday evening. People telling me that they're heartbroken to see a part of Paris crumble in the way that it did. People absolutely amazed at the speed with which those flames tore through that historic monument from the medieval period. Tourists, too, really quite amazed to find themselves in Paris at this extraordinary moment. I'm joined now by two American tourists, a mother and son. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on France 24. Tell me, just what is it like for you as a tourist being in Paris today?
This is an incredible and very tragic moment, really. I feel like my heart is really beating for the people of Paris, the people here, the people back home all over the world. This is a piece of history that has contained so much life force, really, culture, history, tradition, and even religious connection for so many people. And I believe, even like Victor Hugo said, in the form of a sanctuary, he said, the saints were his friends and they blessed him. The monsters were his friends and they guarded him. That was from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and that's almost like the epitome of sanctuary for all these people. And to watch that burn up in flames and go ablaze here and watch everything somewhat get eviscerated is devastating. So
this is a historical and architectural landmark for so many people, and I feel, for me, somewhat taken for granted because I was here years ago, but it's been 20-some years, and the last time we were here together, he was so young he doesn't even really remember it, and this was on our plan to come see today, and then to hear that this fire started last night and this has happened is just, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to think how it especially must feel for the people of Paris and France.
And this is, of course, a huge disaster for Paris, for France as a whole, but also for America. A lot of Americans, there's a special place for Notre-Dame Cathedral in their hearts.
Absolutely. As I said, there's such a religious connection for so many people. And it's so difficult to even talk about it right now, to be honest. There's so much that it contains as a piece of heritage, even for us back in the U.S. The church connection is something very special, and so to watch that be, fortunately enough, still here with us, but knowing that there might be a piece of it that we're not able to get back, that really is heartbreaking.
And this fire did, of course, break out at the beginning of Holy Week, an extraordinarily important week for Christians. A poignant time for this fire to break out.
It truly is. I mean, as someone that was raised Christian and being in a family of Catholics, it's hard to even comprehend what it means or what the symbolism may be that this has happened at the beginning of Holy Week. We're We're actually here for a documentary film that my son directed, and it's on cultural issues and the experiences of Ukrainians being forced to flee the Soviet Union during World War II. And religion was such an important to them and important in keeping them together when they went through Europe and ultimately went to America. And this is just an incredibly important week. And to have this be like this now is just devastating.
And there is, of course, a lot of talk now about when the reconstruction will happen, how it's going to be funded. How important is it for you, for Notre-Dame, to be restored to its former glory?
For me, it would be amazing to have this structure be completely restored to its original form, but there's something to be said about that. There's something that is what's happened has occurred, and then it's a memory for us. If we can restore it, that would be amazing, but we know that all of this is not just about the material form, but also the memory form that it pertains in everybody in this generation. We need to remember what's happened so that we can learn from it in the future.
I agree with that, but I also think it's important to remember, as devastating as this is, that parts of this have been rebuilt and restored in the past, and it can happen again. So we don't have to view it as something that there is no hope at all. It will be different, but it's also not the first time there's been changes in restoration over the last millennia almost.
Indeed. Thank you both so much for speaking to us here on France 24. Proof that this is a tragedy that's hit at the heart of France, but also tourists, people who love to come to France.
That's Haxie Myers-Belkin there reporting for us from just in front of Notre-Dame Cathedral. And we're just hearing now that to pay tribute to this horrific fire that ripped through Notre-Dame Cathedral on Wednesday, that's to say tomorrow, at 6:50 p.m., which is the time when the fire first broke out, all of the church bells across the entire nation of France will be ringing out in solidarity for this fire that broke out at Notre-Dame Cathedral. A fire, as you can see behind me, burned through 2/3 of the roof and also brought down the cathedral's iconic spire. Now, when that fire broke out, the cathedral, which is, let me remind you, 850 years old, was in the midst of a massive restoration and renovation project already. France 24's Nicholas Rushworth takes a look at that.
The cathedral, built between the 12th and 14th centuries, was in a state of disrepair. Renovation on the spire and other parts of the Gothic edifice was underway. Scaffolding was in place. Among the signs of the structure's fragility, some statues strapped in so that they would stay in place. Heritage experts warned of the scale of the task. Speaking to France 24 last June, the architect responsible for the cathedral's restoration explained that cement dating back to the 19th century was causing problems.
The stone is porous. The cement is rock solid, so solid that when water enters the masonry, it can only seep out through the stone and not the cement, so the stones are getting completely worn down and the cement seal remains intact.
A 100-meter-high crane was used several days ago to remove 16 statues from the spire as part of the restoration. They were to be put back in several years' time. They are now what remains intact of the spire. The cathedral, over its 8.5 centuries, has been hit by fire before. This one is devastating.
This is France 24 and our continuing live coverage in the aftermath of that fire that devastated Notre-Dame Cathedral overnight, the Cathédrale de Notre-Dame. France 24's Douglas Herbert is here with me as well to talk a bit more about this. And Doug, I think it's really important for us to remind our viewers that this fire, this tragedy, came at a really interesting and pivotal time in regard to French politics. Of course, you all know that the Yellow Vest protests have been going on in France for over 5 months now. And last night, before we got news of the fire, the French French president, President Macron, was due to give some policy propositions on live TV about exactly what happened in the wake of the grand debate. Tell us about that.
Yeah, very fraught timing here. The context, obviously France has been in the midst of what has been, week after week of a popular uprising, the Yellow Vest uprisings. And the speech that Emmanuel Macron was actually scheduled to give 8 p.m. local time last night. It was scheduled to be broadcast little over an hour after we first heard of this fire. It was all France was talking about throughout the day on Monday. It was the talk of the town. Everyone was waiting to hear exactly how he was going to concretely respond, what sort of measures he was going to announce to try to allay a lot of the grievances, a lot of the complaints, and a lot of the anger of the Yellow Vest protesters. Well, clearly, this is one event which put the kibosh on that, if you will. What's interesting about this is he went from, in the matter of hours, a sort of political climate here where there was a lot of division, a lot of speculation, a lot of people preemptively already dismissing Emmanuel Macron's measures in advance. No matter what he was going to say, it was going to perhaps be dismissed out of hand by some people, embraced by others. It was creating already a lot of division. And given the level of symbolism, given the fact, as we were saying before, that Notre-Dame is really part of the fabric of French society and French people's lives throughout its history, that, as Emmanuel Macron put it, is the epicenter of French lives. It is literally the stage on which French history has been played out. It's perhaps ironically the one thing that is unifying right now in a country which has been very polarized, very divided, bitterly divided, and it's really hard to find anyone here who can disagree about this being a tragedy for everyone. Sure, you can argue Notre-Dame is a Catholic church. It's a cathedral for Catholics, and France is 2/3 Catholic nation. But the fact of the matter is, this is a cathedral which, by sheer virtue of its resilience throughout history and what it has seen and witnessed, it transcends religion. It's not just a cathedral. It's not just a church. It's really, in a sense, Paris's epicenter, the spiritual home of a lot of French people, regardless of what their religion is. So it is, in a strange way, a unifying. This is a unifying tragedy at a moment where France has not had many unifying moments.
And Doug, just looking forward now, how do we see what will be the eventual renovation, the restoration of the cathedral playing out? The money, it's going to cost an exorbitant amount of money. It's going to take decades.
The renovation, which was ongoing, and the renovation which perhaps speculation could have been at the origin of this fire, some sort of accident, a work accident during that renovation, that was just to restore and repair the spire and remove some lead from the spire, the toppled spire. And that was going to be tens of millions of euros. You can imagine now, given the fact the spire is gone, 2/3 of the roof, if not more, is now gone, that wooden framework of the transept and all of that, it could be hundreds of millions of euros. We could talk 200-300 million euros. I was speaking earlier about if you want to find a silver lining in all this, and it's obviously not a moment of many silver linings, it's that the collective spirit that this has brought out, not just in France, but across the world. We have had some of France's richest families stepping forward with donations, offers of donations, 100-200 million euros. The Pinault family, the Arnault family, one of France's biggest multinational companies, Total, oil giant, is also stepping in with some donations. So this is something that everyone's sort of coming together online. You've had a lot of already collections going on which have raised tens of thousands of euros, and it's going to continue. Apparently, French state TV is going to be also holding in the next few days sort of an evening of public donation, fundraising really, to rebuild Notre-Dame Cathedral. So these announcements just keep on coming, and the donations keep on coming in. So this really is something that is bringing the French together in a spirit of rebuilding and renewal. They want to see Notre-Dame, if not restored exactly to its former glory, at least restored to a semblance thereof.
Doug, thank you so much for that. France 24's Doug Herbert. Let's now take a look again at the devastation that ripped through Notre-Dame Cathedral last night in Paris.